Welcome, listeners, to the Everlasting Stories podcast, brought to you by Semper Serpent Books in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm your host, Michael Strand. And tonight I'm proud to present to you our story, Detective Luke Miller and the Stolen Saxon Sword by D. Zane Davis. It's the beginning of a brand new series right here on the podcast, and you're not going to want to miss it. Now, tonight's episode is the first entry of the case files of Detective Luke Miller, who is a hard-boiled private eye from the mean streets of St. Paul. And he gets into magical adventures of all sorts, which you will hear here on the podcast. Now, if you would like to read these stories, you can find them at patreon.com/SixSemperSerpent for just $1 a month. And if you want early access to new episodes of this podcast, you can sign up at the $3 a month level. Also, consider sharing this episode on social media. Chances are your friends will love it too. Okay, friends, without further hesitation, let's begin tonight's story. Detective Luke Miller and the Stolen Saxon Sword by D. Zane Davis. Streetlights glared like the eyes of drunken revelers too far gone to depart prudently. His lungs fired like an engine high in the mountains, desperately sucking in the tepid autumn air. His quarry within sight, but pulling ahead as sidewalk gave way to intersection. Private investigator Luke Miller became snared in the rapids of concert-goers tumbling from a nearby venue. He broke free and bolted to the intersection, but his nimble, hooded prey made it across the boulevard just before a bumper-to-bumper surge of traffic, spearheaded by a pair of snarling diesel juggernauts, clogged the concrete. Luke was left standing beneath an aluminum stepladder, erected so a show that would be universally panned by critics could be advertised across the marquee of the Orpheum Theater. "Don't you know, walking under a ladder's bad luck, son?" A shapeless pile of rags growled. Luke turned to face the gnarled stump of a vagrant. "Not superstitious," he shouted over the dissonant sonata of traffic. The bleached remains of a fedora rotated slowly from side to side. "Fate don't care whether you believe in it or not," it hollered in reply. Luke caught the rebuttal in his right palm and tossed it back, shaking his head in despair. With that job gone, he'd need to be creative to pay this month's rent. "Well, Shelby," Luke announced to his genial mutt as he clattered through his office door, "hope you have a little meat left on that ham bone I gave you yesterday, because it looks like—" The Art Nouveau sculpture, seated in the far corner of his waiting room, numbed his tongue. He fell headlong into her indigo irises. He would have tumbled through their cerulean infinity forever had a voice like a sterling silver bell not caught him and pulled him out. "Mr. Miller?" it rang. "How did you get in here?" Luke inquired dumbly. "The door was unlocked," she answered disinterestedly, the lily fingers of her left hand resting on Shelby's charcoal head. "The lights were on, and I assumed you were still accepting clients." She tucked a raven's feather of hair behind her ear. Her long, delicate features studied him curiously. Luke nodded, certain he'd locked the door, but unable to overlook the word client. The woman's slender frame rose and floated across the room. Her attire matched the cut and color of her hair, short and black. Her manner suggested she was older than Luke's 30-odd years, but her marble features made it difficult to tell. Mr. Miller, I need your help to recover an item that has been stolen from me, she pronounced. Her blue eyes stood almost level with his russet ones, making her around 6 feet in height. He nodded, nearly succeeding at appearing less dumbfounded, and ushered her into his office. Before entering himself, he drug fingers through his disheveled badger's mane of hair and aligned the V-neck of his T-shirt, which had once possessed identifiable color, with the burnished buckle on the leather strap retaining his worn grayish jeans. A few moments later, she was seated opposite him, her figure lending elegance to his second-hand office furniture. How familiar are you with Anglo-Saxon poetry, Mr. Miller? She asked, looking through him as though he were glass. He began hoarsely. We read some Shakespeare in my high school English class. Shakespeare falls within the category of early modern English, she corrected him as though it were tomorrow's weather forecast. Anglo-Saxon literature is far, far older. Are you familiar with the epic of Beowulf? Yeah, I've heard of it. Well, to make a long story short, she began with a waving gesture of her hand, Beowulf is a great hero. He slays 2 monsters and becomes king of his people. At his side is his sword, Naegling, a weapon of great prowess. It served him well until, after 50 years as king, a dragon is awoken and ravages his kingdom. In the ensuing battle, Naegling is shattered and Beowulf is killed, though a brave warrior named Wiglaf still managed to destroy the beast. Sure. Quite a legend, Luke interrupted. Ah, a legend indeed. Her smile could stop an incoming cruise missile. But, like so many legends, the story of Beowulf has roots in reality. While his exploits might be mythical, Beowulf and his sword really existed. And how might you know that, Mrs. Harriet, she answered. Dahlia Harriet. And I know that the story is true because I came to possess the pieces of Naegling myself. Okay, Miss Harriet, Luke replied sarcastically. You're sure you didn't get lost on your way to a Lord of the Rings cosplay party? Oh, we do in fact have Professor J.R.R. Tolkien to thank for our contemporary appreciation of the Beowulf legend, she shot back unfazed. He was no doubt inspired by the tale in writing his own mythology. However, I assure you, this ancient sword is real and has been stolen from me. It turned out that Dahlia Harriet, professor of Old English poetry and archaeology, was a collector of sorts. She had found the sword several years previously while on a dig in Gotland, Sweden. She translated the still legible runes on the fragments of decayed metal, realized what it was, and discreetly brought Naegling back to Minneapolis. Which is precisely why I cannot report the theft to the police, she admitted. My actions are not strictly legal. However, if I let the university take the sword, it would have languished in an archive for decades. I've made it my task to prove its authenticity, and once certain, I will announce my findings and take full responsibility for my actions. How magnanimous, Luke cooed cloyingly. Why should I help recover stolen property you took in the first place? Because I will pay you $250,000 for your discreet trouble, she said nonchalantly. Half now, and the other half when Naegling is back in my possession. She removed a stack of $100 bills from her ebony handbag and tossed it on the desk. though the thud that echoed through the office may well have come from Luke's chin hitting the imitation oak. His conscience poked its razor fingernails into his amygdala, but, looking between Shelby as she chiseled at her rapidly attenuating hambone and the skyscraper of bills at the corner of his desk, Luke pushed aside his conscience and accepted the job. Within a moment, they had exited the second-rate office building and were entering a black Maserati, which waited for them outside. Traffic had grown lethargic as drivers pondered whether it was still evening or officially night. A chauffeur piloted the behemoth sedan over dark serpents of concrete, slithering their way across the metro. Somewhere, far west of downtown, Miss Harriet's residence lay behind unassuming concrete ramparts. A steel gate opened its maw as quietly as the sedan idled. On the other side, the house was smaller than the state capitol, though a bit less modest. If many affluent dwellings are called McMansions, one could say Miss Harriet's house had 3 Michelin stars. Servants in black uniforms ushered the pair inside. From the corner of a white reception room, large enough to play tennis in, an elevator transported Luke and his client what felt like several miles closer to the center of the earth. The elevator doors opened to a laboratory that would have been the envy of any university or museum. However, every drawer and cabinet door stood ajar, and the back door, rated for a Minuteman nuclear missile silo, had been blasted open with what must have been some serious plastic explosives. Whoever had done the job knew what they were doing and what they were looking for, but had done a poor job of covering their tracks. Luke quickly found and lifted a perfect thumbprint from the massive gray drawer that had housed the Saxon sword. I know a guy in the Minneapolis PD," Luke assured his client, tucking the evidence into the pocket of his faded M65 field jacket. "I'll take it to him in the morning." "Thank you, Mr. Miller," she said, the alloy of her voice richened with copper. The brand of her lips warmed his cheek long after he'd returned to his apartment in St. Paul. The next morning was a Saturday. Sergeant Mike Tomlinson planned to spend it helping Advent Lutheran Church prepare their annual Yule Board Christmas dinner, despite the unseasonably warm early December weather. "Oofda," the bald cop boomed. "This lutefisk is limp. Have you been changing the water every day, Helen?" He hollered towards the kitchen, punctuating his dissatisfaction by slamming his spoon into the china plate, the jelly-like fish jiggling ashamedly before him. "Of course, Mike," Helen shouted back, unseen. "I've been making that stuff since you were no taller to my knee." "Yeah, well, this batch is no good," Tomlinson shouted back, making a beeline for the kitchen. "You can't have limp lutefisk," Luke interrupted, his ratty sneakers squeaking on the faded linoleum. "Oh, no," Tomlinson sighed, setting his plate on a Formica folding table. "What is it this time?" Luke held out the fingerprint. "I need you to run this, ASAP. It's for a very important case." "Ugh, bring it to me on Monday," the big cop insisted. "Can't you see I'm busy here?" "Listen, Mike," the detective pleaded. "I only need you to put this into the system right away, but I can't give you any details." "Of course not." "But I gotta find the maker of this print before he skips town. You got it?" Tomlinson's head glowed under pale fluorescence as it shook. "Who's gonna help Helen make the lutefisk?" "I will," Luke fired back. "Please, I'll stay here while you take that into the station. I'm serious." "Fine," he sighed before shouting to the kitchen. "Helen, I gotta run to the office real quick. Luke here is gonna help you with the next batch of lutefisk." "Okay," Helen barked back. "Luke, you try that lutefisk and see if you think it's limp." Luke's face took on the texture of the fish in front of him. Tomlinson smiled in minute triumph. As the cop marched out of the basement, Luke picked up the plate and eyed its unpleasant contents. Before he could pick up the spoon, however, his phone rang. The word shoot lingered in the air long after Luke had bolted for his car. Where in the hell have you been? Natasha hissed. They stood apart from the children and other parents. I sent you the invitation months ago. I know, Luke effused. I got stuck at work today. Bullshit. Her hazel eyes sizzled. It's bad enough you forget your daughter's birthday party. At least have the wherewithal to admit it. Tash, he attempted to rebut. No, she interrupted. You go over and you wish Annika a happy birthday, and then you get your sorry ass out of here. Should I also assume you neglected to bring her present? He pulled out the card he'd bought at CVS on the way over. Is there anything in it? I wrote her a note. I'm a little strapped for Of course you are, she seethed, cutting him off. I'll give you one thing, Luke. You're consistent, always broke, always unable to fulfill your most basic obligations as a parent. Listen, he urged. The case is big, and if Luke, she sighed, cooling. If only you'd solved this case. If only you'd had a job that could support your daughter. If only you'd spent half as much time with your family as you did with your work. She paused to study her pink tennis shoes. After a moment, she looked back up, eyes glistening. I've never stopped loving the dreamer in you, Luke. But eventually, some dreams, they have to become reality. Annika was a 5-year-old version of her mother, an elf with big bright eyes and shining blonde hair. Today, it was gathered in a single bun atop her head, a style Natasha favored after years as a dancer. The fizzy sprite wrapped her arms around Luke's leg, laughing a petite variation of her mother's giggle. He rarely heard the grown-up version these days. As Luke went to pick her up, however, a dwarvish rent-a-clown interrupted. Hey there, birthday girl. Do you want a balloon? Listen, pal, Luke began, but his daughter also shared her mother's propensity for interrupting. Yeah, I want a balloon, she cheered. All right, okay, Luke moaned. Just make it quick, will ya, Bojangles? Oh, the name is funny, Fred, the older gentleman beneath the white face paint clarified with a chuckle. He spent the next millennium making a balloon dog for Annika, narrating each step with a miserable pun. And finally we twist the tail, he finished, handing the animal to Annika. All right, thank you. Luke nearly succeeded at being cordial. And how about you? Funny Fred inquired. Oh, no, I'm good. Make one for Daddy, Annika clapped gleefully. Fred complied. All right, fella, he announced, twisting a green balloon into an elongated lowercase t and handing it to Luke. Here you go, Fred spoke proudly. Since she's the birthday lady, you can be her brave knight with this sword. Luke imagined it being sharp enough to impale the clown, but he smiled and thanked the man instead. Finally, he turned to his daughter. Okay, Annie, he smiled. It's time for cake, Natasha chirped, swooping in and picking up the toddler. Come on, Annie. You get to blow out all 5 candles. Annika turned to look at Luke. Is Daddy coming? Daddy has to go, sweetie, Natasha answered for Sir Luke. His ex-wife nearly obscured her pity as she walked away. Luke would have protested, but his phone rang first. Hey, Luke, Mike the police officer growled over the phone. Yeah? The results came back on that print, the cop said proudly. It belongs to Dr. Elgin A. Lambert, a professor at the U. All right. Thanks a million. I'll give him a call.
I'd like to see you try.
Mike scoffed. Well, why's that? Luke pressed.
Luke, Professor Lambert died 10 years ago.
Personnel records indicated that Professor Elgin Alfred Lampert had served as a professor of pre Christian Scandinavian religions at the university from 1983 until 2005. His career seemed unremarkable until Luke came upon a series of newspaper clippings. Luke vaguely recalled the story. In the latter years of Lambert's life, his research had apparently turned to the more mystical elements of Scandinavian paganism. In 2004, the university security broke up a midnight ritual being conducted in an abandoned steam tunnel beneath the campus. Lampert was orchestrating the rite, attended by at least a dozen robed followers, including students. Several participants had deep cuts all over their hands and arms. The professor had been collecting their blood in a goblet. No explanation was given, but with parents lining up to sue, Lambert was forced into retirement. He moved to an undisclosed location in southwest Minnesota, and a year later, he died of natural causes. He'd never been married and had no children. Though it was a curious story, with Lambert deceased, Luke seemed to hit a literal dead end. Considering his options, Luke decided his best bet was to return to Miss Harriet's lab to try to find traces of explosive on the battered back door. Perhaps Mike would be able to trace them to a known maker or supplier. He began dialing his phone, but a rattle on the door interjected. Come in, he answered, wondering if Miss Harriet had quietly returned to check in, but instead, an elderly gentleman sauntered into his office. The man's dark suit and gold pince-nez glasses looked expensive. May I help you, sir? I believe you can, the man said, in a voice too powerful for his apparent age. I've heard you're looking for me. You see, I'm Professor Elgin Lambert. Luke heaved with laughter. Now this beats all. All right, Professor, you go back to the station and tell Mike his pranks are a real waste of department resources, but that's pretty good. He would have kept laughing had the man not dissipated like smoke in a gust of wind. Do you think this a joke, Mr. Miller? The man's voice asked from everywhere and nowhere. Luke rubbed his eyes and shook his head. If this is a joke, it ain't funny anymore, he said. No joke, Mr. Miller, the voice continued. You're looking for me, and so I have found you. I've also found this. As the last word resonated, the man's snowy-haired figure popped into view like a camera flash. The sword contained in his right hand glistened as though it were liquid beneath the sun. The swirling Damascusine blade was covered in strange upright runes. The square hilt matched the material of the man's spectacles and was far more intricately decorated than the plates in Mike's church basement. He waved it in the air, reading the symbols. He smiled like a threatened dog and swung the sword towards the dumbstruck detective. Luke took up Fun Fred's balloon, felt suddenly ridiculous, and dropped it to the floor. He pondered whether the legend that one remains conscious immediately after decapitation was true or not. However, the ghostly blade stopped short, coming to rest against his throat, the metal icy. This, the professor announced, is Nagling, the fabled blade of King Beowulf. A blade made for him by the gods themselves. A blade that bestows divine power upon its owner. But Beowulf's pride betrayed him. He thought himself capable of destroying that dragon alone. The gods abandoned him, and Nagling shattered when he needed it most. He died, and what was left of the blade was buried with him and forgotten for millennia. The sword shattered in the phantom's hand. The pieces fell onto the desk, rust and mold encasing them like a swarm of hornets. But I discovered that, if it could be found, Naegling could be remade through the darkest of magic. Restored, it would again grant its wearer the power of a god. The rotten shards floated upward, the corrosion dissolved, the pieces rejoined, and the hilt again found the professor's hand. Unfortunately, the professor's beard waggled. My work was discovered. I was banished from civilized society, and I died before my quest could be completed. That would have been the end, but the fates clearly had other plans for me. One of my loyal former students took a job working for your friend, Professor Harriet. Working in her lab, the man discovered that Harriet had stolen the sword for herself. Wisely, he gathered my followers, and they used their blood to summon my spirit so I might finish my task. Well, if I believe all that, Luke inquired, as if he might, how does a ghost leave a fingerprint? Oh, just a little breadcrumb I left for you to track me down, the professor sneered. You see, the sacrifice needs to be worthy for the final ritual to work. I had to ensure that you weren't a total rube. Final ritual? Final ritual? Luke squeaked. Of course, Lambert replied. I am but a ghost, and this sword is but a pile of rust. It will take a human sacrifice to restore our full being. The professor's phantasm faded away, a sickening smile etched on his face. Just then, the door burst open, and 3 huge men, equivalent to 6 Lukes, clomped in. A little while later, Luke found himself sitting on the edge of his desk, his hands and feet bound. The thugs growled among themselves in the opposite corner of his dingy little office, waiting for something. Luke wondered if the whole thing was some sort of dream, some kind of hallucination. Maybe he'd run into that traffic yesterday, been hit by a truck, and was in a coma. That had to be it. That seemed like the best case scenario at this point. Luke. Someone seemed to whisper. He eyed the thugs, but they weren't even looking in his direction. Luke. The voice hissed again. Down here. His eyes found shaggy Shelby, her doggy eyes fixed upon him, and tail wagging. I don't believe it, he sighed. Believe it, she assured him telepathically. Remember when that old man told you that the fates don't care whether you believe in them or not? Oh my God, how did you... Luke cocked his head to one side, as though he were the dog. Miss Harriet showed it to me last night before you came, Shelby replied. She showed me what happened, and it made it possible for me to communicate with you, but I don't know for how long. Oh, great. A talking dog. Luke's reply was dry enough to make one thirsty. Luke, listen, the canine urged. Ladders aren't portents of bad luck. They're portals between realms of fate. A lot of people run under that particular ladder, but the fates specifically chose you to complete this task. Ruff, trust yourself, and when the time is right, you'll have the strength to succeed. Oh, gosh. How am I supposed to do that, The detective moaned in his thoughts. I don't know, Shelby answered. I'm just a dog. Before she could continue, the thugs approached their sacrifice. Shelby darted between their feet, took the balloon sword in her mouth, and galloped out of the office. One of the goons attempted to make chase, but his cinderblock body simply could not catch the nimble pooch. He returned a second later, doing his best impression of Shelby's panting. Oh, just forget it. It's a stupid mutt anyway, just trying to play, he said as his greasy eyes fell on Luke. Unfortunately for you, fella, she ain't no lassie. Come on, it's time to go. The limestone cavern walls towered above the cloaked heads of the congregation. At one end of the vast chamber, a bus-sized turban revealed that this room was once used to harness the Mississippi River to power one of the mill city's namesakes. Today, the machinery was silent, the dark hall instead filled with the menacing hum of Saxon incantations, muttered by a dozen or so parishioners. The spells swirled through the air, ricocheting off the damp walls and crashing into one another in cacophonous malevolence. As the invocations reached a crescendo, a veiled figure strode into the center of the semicircular gathering, a gem-studded goblet in his hand. He raised the cup, allowing Luke to see that both his wrists were oozing blood. The cloaked cleric placed the chalice on the ground and stepped back. From the opposite side, another robed figure stepped forward, carrying a polished wooden case. Opening it revealed the rusty fragments of nagling. Like the first warlock, the priest raised the case into the air for all to see before setting it next to the chalice. Above the relics, the ghost of Professor Lambert materialized like a camera focusing on a distant object. In his diaphanous hand, the phantom held Nagling's reincarnation. The specter spun around to survey the crowd. "Hot," he bellowed. "So, the time has come, my followers, for two that were dead to live again. The hour is upon us. Tonight, a new king takes his rightful place at the right hand of the gods." Though his captors had freed his ankles so that he could walk the 1,000 steps down into the dire crypt, Luke could not slow the thugs as they dragged him towards the professor. One slammed him to his knees before the fiend, while another picked up a shimmering axe, the sort that separated Anne Boleyn's body from her head. In the dim, the blade seemed to hover in a way that would have appeared supernatural had Luke not already encountered a ghost, a telepathic dog, and a magic sword that day. The detective bowed his head, attempting to recall even one prayer he learned at St. Agnes School, and he failed. His attempts at gaining intercession from other gods were interrupted by barking. From behind the turbine, Shelby came barreling towards the congregation, balloon sword gently held in her jaws. Luke wondered how she'd found him. Like a furry artillery shell, she leaped through the foggy professor and slammed her full 60 pounds into the executioner, toppling the goon to the ground. Fun Fred the Clown's gift came floating down in front of Luke, an odd accessory in a room decorated with ancient black magic. "To hell with you mortals," the professor boomed. "I'll do this myself." He raised a nagling over his head with an effort that appeared to strain even a spectral being. He swung downward, aiming directly for Luke's head. Gotta believe, gotta believe, gotta believe," Luke sputtered frenetically. His bound hands picked up the balloon and raised it. Though he knew it would be no match for supernatural steel, he closed his eyes. A thunderous crash echoed through the limestone hall. Luke opened his eyes to see his piece of airy green plastic stoutly blocking the ghostly blade. The professor grimaced and howled. He raised the sword and swung again. In a daze, Luke parried the blow with his blown-up bludgeon. Around him, the cloaked mystics crept away. The ghost swung again, and again Luke stopped the strike. Growing more confident, he got to his feet. Luke thought back to the 3 years of fencing he'd taken as a kid and tried to replicate the moves as accurately as he could with a balloon and bound wrists. Absent the sinister setting, The performance would have been pretty comical. However, while Lambert's fury grew, the ghost could not land a blow. "What magic is this?" the increasingly desperate professor cried out. "I have no idea," Luke shouted, going on the offense, "but I believe it's more powerful than yours." With that, he swung hard at Nagling, near the hilt. The impact knocked the spectral sword from Lambert's hands, and as it flew away from him, it disintegrated again, landing across the floor in rusty shards. "No! No!" Lambert cried. Luke saw his chance and charged the defenseless spirit, spearing him through the heart with the balloon. With a blood-curdling shriek, the phantasm exploded in a polychromatic flash. The chamber was silent for a moment. Then the walls echoed with a rapid staccato of footsteps and panicked whispers as the departed demon's followers fled in terror. Shelby barked, "Good riddance." The black Maserati was waiting when Luke emerged onto the street. The chauffeur's uniform made him seem as though he had manifested from the night itself. Luke could no longer be sure if such a thing was impossible. He slumped into the seat of cream cowhide, sword and chalice containing case in hand, while Shelby hopped into the plushy, upholstered footwell. Miss Dahlia Harriet seemed to glow as she sat, what felt like an acre away on the other side of the cabin. "Clever using the axe to cut your bonds," she began, the peal of her voice resonating deep within Luke's chest. She picked up the case from where Luke had set it beside him. Her smile could have turned a new moon full as she looked inside. "Ah, it's all here. And, if I'm not mistaken, this is the very goblet whose theft awoke Beowulf's destroyer. It's as I suspected. The curse placed on this chalice by an ancient wicked race some 300 years before even Beowulf's time is what gave Lambert and his followers the ability to raise him from the dead. Excellent, excellent work, Mr. Miller. The world will be much safer after I return this talisman to its bewitched barrow deep in a forgotten corner of Godeland." "Who are you?" Luke demanded tiredly. "My real name is Freya," she answered. "Are you some kind of witch?" "Hardly. I'm a reincarnation of the goddess of war and beauty," she said matter-of-factly, "manifested on Earth to protect its people from evil." "If you're a goddess," the detective thought aloud, "couldn't you have just stopped Lambert yourself?" "If only things were so simple," she replied, with a laugh that could have calmed a squall. "A bit like parents, we gods can guide and mentor, but ultimately we have to let humans steer their own course." "How noble," Luke sighed. "You were quite noble tonight. Noble indeed," Freya pronounced. "Had you lived in Beowulf's time, you could have become quite a warrior, even as skinny as you are. Back then, though, I would have given you an impressive blade, like Nagling, not one disguised as a child's party favor." "That's why," he answered with a surprised smirk, studying the balloon tucked in his belt. "So, Fred the Clown? Broker, dwarf armorer to the gods." "Well, I'll be damned," Luke pronounced. "Well, I appreciate your compliments, Freya, but I think I'll stick to the detective work." "Well, that is until I need you again," she added nonchalantly. "Again?" he bemoaned. "You mean there are more ghostly academics attempting to take over the world?" "Perhaps," she shrugged, "and perhaps not. You know, I'm not merely the patron of war and beauty. I'm also the goddess of love and of sex. Luke's head snapped to face her. She grinned and looked out the window. The city passed by, its illuminated windows a cluster of terrestrial stars embedded in the vast emptiness of prairie. At length, the car came to a whispering halt before Luke's apartment. Here we are, Freya spoke sweetly. Opening her purse, she withdrew another stack of hundreds and handed them to the detective. Here is your payment. She slid across the seat until her thighs touched his. Nearly drowning him in her sapphire ocean eyes, she whispered, "And here is your reward." Her ruby lips liquefied him. The kiss lasted a second or an aeon, but touching her made the distinction irrelevant. Eventually, she poured him onto the sidewalk, with Shelby wagging her bushy tail at his side. Before the Maserati pulled away, her window lowered, her eyes shone brighter than Venus. Until next time, Luke, her voice like warm velvet. Then the window closed, and the car silently slipped away. On the other side of the doorway, Natasha stood surprised, and not happily so. I know, Luke began. I should have called first. I couldn't wait to give Annie a real present. If you're busy, I'll just leave it with you, okay? And I don't have to see her. He revealed the deluxe set of plastic building blocks he'd been concealing behind his back. His ex-wife's eyes expanded to fill her face. And, he continued, I have something for you as well. Wait. He shifted the present under one arm and pulled an envelope from the pocket of his old army coat. Natasha grew pale as her stubby fingers thumbed the 20s. 3 months of missed child support, plus interest, he clarified quickly. You steal this? She squeaked. No, he smiled. I told you, I had a big case, I got paid. Natasha smiled and shook her head, the bun atop it wagging like Shelby's tail. This is a dream come true, Luke, she admitted kindly. Okay, we don't have playgroup for another hour. Why don't you come in and give Annie your present yourself? She's already had breakfast, so you should have a little time to play. He nodded and stepped across the threshold. Thanks a lot. What's that? Natasha inquired, noticing the green balloon still tucked in Luke's belt. Oh, he shrugged. I guess I'm a warrior. She sighed and shut the door behind him. Alrighty, listeners, that is tonight's story. I hope you liked listening to it as much as I enjoyed producing it and recording it. Once again, you heard Luke Miller and the Stolen Saxon Sword by D. Zane Davis, the first episode in a brand new series on the Everlasting Stories podcast from Sick Semper Serpent Books. This story, the first Luke Miller story, was originally published in Spontaneous Combustion, Volume 2 by Sic Semper Serpent. That was published early in 2018 and is available for sale from our website. It contains another 10 stories by fantastic Minnesota authors, so please check that out. And if you liked this story, head on over to patreon.com/SixSemperSerpent and support us by subscribing. For $1, you can read the archive. For $3, you get early access to new episodes, and there are more perks from there. So please support local literature, homemade, homebrewed Minnesota literature over at patreon.com. We truly appreciate all of the support and love that you show for us, and we're putting our all into making new fantastic fiction just for you. As always, the text for this story and the audio for this podcast were produced by me, Michael Strand, managing editor at Semper Serpent. The author of tonight's story was D. Zane Davis, beloved English teacher and Semper Serpent writer. And the publisher of tonight's episode was T. Martin Krause, editor-in-chief at Semper Serpent Books. And finally, the music tonight was provided by Jesse Spillane. Check out his work over at the Free Music Archive. Thank you, listeners, so very much for supporting the podcast, for subscribing, for sharing us on social media, and for listening. We deeply appreciate it. We'll see you next time on the Everlasting Stories podcast.